Well, as I talked about a couple days ago, the United States has decided to, for the first time, permanently station troops just across the water from mainland China, potentially sparking a war with the largest economy on the planet. This is how we've decided to use our military. Well, at the same time, we have, I know this gets said a lot, because it has always been bad. We've always had a rather porous border. You just look at it, folks, objectively. This is as bad as it's ever been. There have never been more people pouring across the American border from all sides, from the Mexican side, along the coast of Florida. Well, maybe Florida's had worse times individually, but collectively, the whole country, all this stuff, it's never been this bad. And no, the military is not doing a damn thing about it. No, the military is too busy guarding oil fields for ExxonMobil that they stole from the people of Syria. Just like they were too busy bombing grain silos and water treatment plants in Yemen. Just keep in mind, if you know anyone who is interested somehow in signing up to join the U.S. military, maybe they're just such a blind patriot that they think that, the military somehow protects our freedom or something. Find some way, you know them personally, but please, if you care about this person, talk them out of it. Because the U.S. military has one job, and that is to protect the financial and political interests of powerful people. That is all they do. There is no protecting freedom. There's no protecting the innocent. There's none of that. They're protecting the worst, well, perhaps maybe not the very worst people, but some of the worst people on Earth. I mean, I don't want to pretend that there aren't worse people than ExxonMobil executives. I mean, that's just nonsense. That would be silly hippy-dippy commie propaganda. There are worse people in the world than ExxonMobil executives and lobbyists. But lobbyists, they're up there. They're definitely in the bottom rung as far as worthwhile members of society, because they are a net drain. Lobbyists and corporate executives are right there just below welfare queens. And I only put below the welfare queens because each individual person who just spends their entire life living in public housing and, getting their Obama phones and their food stamps, going to eat at Fleming's, they take so much less money away from us than the war whores and the and the corporate welfare queens, that they're never going to be as bad as those people. But anyway, that is who the military protects. That is all they're willing to protect. The Coast Guard, they seem to do some good work. They also help stranded vessels. So, maybe encourage them, if they're going to join some kind of military branch, join the Coast Guard. And I think most people probably, if anything, look down on the Coast Guard compared to other branches of the military. But at least they serve some kind of function. Maybe the U.S. Navy would also be a worthwhile venture if they actually did anything to defend America, but they don't, of course. The U.S. Navy's job is to, explicitly they say this, protect corporate shipping lanes. Meanwhile, as many people can just float across through American waters and land on our beaches, as want to do so, and the U.S. Navy is not going to lift a finger to prevent it. Likewise, the U.S. Army is never going to protect our border from the hordes, the millions of invaders. No, obviously they're not an invading army, but they are people who are not welcome here, who just waltz right in and take our stuff. And it's not like the people flowing across the border are the biggest issue, in America. It's not the worst thing going on in this country. If that was our only problem, we would still be a pretty great place to live. However, of course, there are always going to be certain localities, like if you're in Texas, South Texas, or anywhere along the border, Arizona, New Mexico, California, the border very well might be the worst thing going on in your life. But I don't want to overblow it and say that America is falling apart just because of the border, because that would give a false sense of hope that if somehow we did fix the problem at the border, which has never been fixed, not since the 1950s, that was the last time anyone ever did anything about the damn problem. I mean, Trump, by sheer force of attitude, just seemed to discourage a lot of border crossings. At least officially, we're told not that many people, compared to what's going on right now, were coming across the border while Trump was president. They seem to be discouraged. But it's not like Trump was, rounding people up Eisenhower style, putting them back on the train across the Rio Grande and dumping them in Juarez. Trump took like a couple of small steps towards mitigating the problem. He did not solve the problem, and the problem is not going to be solved in 4 years anyway. Now, one interesting development, and I think this is still unofficial, but it was a big rumor going around yesterday, that the Republican National Committee has hired this long-haired fellow from Twitter that you might have seen around for many years by the name of Scott Pressler, who's big into that community organizing stuff that the Dems are real good at. He's very passionate about that. And supposedly he's being hired by the RNC to be in charge of ballot harvesting. And this is unrelated, somewhat, from everything I've been talking about for the past 7 minutes. But I do find the idea interesting that, let's just say hypothetically, the Republican Party had as sophisticated and aggressive of a ballot harvesting machine as the Dems do. Now, they're never going to be as effective because, by nature, the Democratic Party, long before as ideologies and things and issues come and go and change, the Democratic Party has always been a machine politics organization going back into the 19th century. The GOP has never been that. The GOP has never specialized in machine politics, and in large part that has to do with the urbanization, or not urbanization, the urbanness, you could say, the urbanity of Democratic constituencies. Democrats, as their politics have changed, over the decades and decades, what has stayed the same is that Democrats know how to produce votes in cities. Now, there was a time when Democrats, up until very recently, were also very competitive and dominant in rural areas, but that was a different strategy. It was a different operation. The ballot harvesting stuff is very much a feature of urban politics, because that's where you have high concentrations of people, and so you want to squeeze as many votes out of these dense, fruitful areas as possible. Whereas when you're trying to mobilize rural voters, it becomes a bit different. It is still possible. Obviously, I think people still remember the mobilization of the migrant farm workers by, only a few decades ago, by what's his name? I know it's Chavez, Cesar Chavez. You don't have to agree with the guy, or you don't have to hate him either. I really have no opinion on him. I wasn't alive back then. From what I've heard, he was a bit of a commie. Also, interestingly enough, as you might imagine, was very since he represented farm workers, laborers who were in the United States, he was very much against mass immigration because that would dilute the bargaining power of his members. Unlike some more modern unions, he did at least seem to be someone who was concerned. He did seem to represent the interests of his actual members. You don't really see that these days with unions. I mean, most of them have turned into a complete joke. But anyway, my point is, I'm not so sure even how the standard ballot harvesting tactics, if applied by the Republican Party, even if they were applied perfectly, I'm not sure how much help that would be to them. The Democrats have a lot more to gain from that sort of thing. So I'll be interested if there is, in fact, an injection of, let's say, higher IQ people into the Republican National Committee, if they do develop some unique strategies as far as this is concerned, coupled with the reality of the disastrous migration crisis that is upon us. I wonder if old Donaldo Trumpo could actually have a shot this fall. I'm not someone who's particularly passionate one way or the other, although I think it's not exactly going out on a limb to say that things would not be as bad if old Trumpy was back. I never go so far as to say that I support him, and I'm a backer of his or something like that, because I don't want to take responsibility for everything that he's wrong about. After all, I was very critical of him while he was president. I was, I think, as critical as I am of Biden, just about different things, perhaps. But on net, it's not exactly very hard to make the call that Mr. Biden is substantially worse. You don't have to be an angel to be better than Sleepy Joe. If anything, though, perhaps the worse the situation gets for Biden, the better things will get for RFK Jr., because there is a substantial portion of this country of people who will just never vote for Donald Trump. They have Trump derangement syndrome. They can't logically decipher, even if they rationally in their head think, well, gee, I think that things were better when he was in charge, and there's a lot of things that, the areas where he has differences with Biden, Trump might be better on, X or Y issue that's really important to me. But at the end of the day, they probably live pretty comfortably in their homes, and they think, you know what, the worst thing that could possibly happen is if I have to turn on the TV and hear Trump's voice. So I want him to go away. So I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. These people exist. It sounds insane, but I've met them. Believe it or not, here in Florida, even though Florida is very overall very pro-Trump state, because of the income levels that you end up here, you get a lot of older Republicans who are just, their lives are good. They're retired. They've already made their money. They're not in a high crime area, and they don't think that their neighborhood's going to fall apart in the next 4 years. They're not going to vote for Trump just because they don't want to hear him. It's that simple of a calculation for them, because they just don't have problems. Then you have people who do have problems. And that's a different calculation for them. But many of them still won't be able to get past the fact that it is Donald Trump's name on the ballot. That's where RFK Jr. comes in. He gives people an out. He gives people an alternative who otherwise would vote for Trump but just can't get past him personally. RFK gives them something to vote for. And honestly, I think that's kind of his lane now. That's kind of how he's campaigning. And I don't think that bodes well for Biden. Because at the end of the day, for your average, I'm not talking the Bill Kristols of the world, I'm talking about real people who actually exist in the country. who live here. I'm not talking about Zionist foreign agents. There are people who are very susceptible and receptive to the America First message, who still hate Trump personally with a strong passion. And if you're in that position, RFK is kind of a no-brainer. Because on most of the big issues, for better or for worse, he sounds a lot like Trump, issue by issue. But he's not Trump. He looks and sounds like a Kennedy. And for me, based on my political history and the way I was brought up, looking and sounding like a Kennedy is a demerit. That's not a good thing for you. Of course, I'm a much more rational person, and so I don't, I can see past that. I don't go like, oh, I didn't like, I grew up in a Republican household, and we didn't like Kennedy, and so this guy who's related to Kennedy and looks and sounds like him, I don't like him either because of how he looks and sounds. It's like, no, I can look objectively on actual issues and his character. But most people, it's not that way. It's a visceral thing. They look at him, and if he says things that generally sound like, it's better than what old Sleepy Joe is pushing, and he has that, kind of Kennedy look and feel to him. These are people who I think could be swayed away from Biden. And I don't want to confuse these folks with the brain-dead Ukraine First crowd. The Ukraine First movement is never going to vote for anyone but Joe Biden. I don't think that that should be a surprise to much of anyone. But the Ukraine First movement is thankfully pretty fringe. They're not as important as they make themselves out to be. And I think that's supported. I'm not a big poll guy, but I think that's supported poll after poll. And certainly by November, almost no Americans are going to be voting based on Ukraine, except for the hardcore Zelensky to the end cultists. So for a while, I was really puzzled by RFK because I thought he just sounded too much like Trump. Again, not only for better but for worse, to the extent that he was, alienating like the far left crowd on issues like Israel, which I found very strange. Like, why would you do that? There's a lot of rumors about RFK being compromised by Mossad or something like that. I don't necessarily think that's the case at this point, because I kind of see a strategy here, and I see how it could work. I'm not saying it will work, but I see how it could work. And that is taking, very mainstream people, mainstream voters within the Democratic Party who just absolutely can't stand Trump, but if you think about it politically, are much more aligned with Trump, because Trump, it's not like he's changed very much personally. He's kind of the same guy he was back when he was a Democrat. Trump he represents 1990s Democrat liberalism. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, he's not a conservative guy, never has been. That's not who he was running on. He's running on 1990s, like Bill Clinton Democrat policy, with some notable exceptions. And obviously it's not all stuff that Bill Clinton actually did, but it's things that Bill Clinton and his voters would have, at least on the surface, nodded their head along with and agreed with. And a lot of those people still exist within the Democratic voter base, but will never, ever, ever vote for Trump. RFK Jr. is appealing to those people. And so I think the VP thing will actually matter in RFK's case. I think that the Jesse Ventura route would be a little too clownish. I actually, as a bit of an unpopular opinion, I think the Aaron Rodgers stuff has some potential, because I think that there are some young people. Although, again, how young are people who would be swayed by Aaron Rodgers? I don't know. I'm not talking like early 20s people, but when you look at the two major candidates and you see two men in their 70s, or actually, Biden's in his 80s now, right? Trump's got to be approaching 80. And RFK's pretty old, too. but he's physically fit. And then you got a guy like Rogers who he looks pretty rough. He looks a lot older than he actually is, but in reality is a pretty youthful guy. When you have contrasts that are that stark, that are very much these are visceral differences. These are lizard brain differences. These are not like logic reason affecting differences, but they really do matter. They matter more than most of that other stuff. The image of youthful, not a gray hair on his head in 2008, biracial Obama against geriatric warmonger John McCain, who looked like a walking cadaver for the last 15 years or so of his life. That really had a big impact in 2008. I think it goes without saying that had it been Joe Biden at the top of the ticket in 2008, you would not have seen the kind of landslide that Barack Obama was able to achieve against John McCain. And it's because of superficial differences. That's what has the biggest impact in politics. Boy, what a mess. I don't even know how to title all this. There's no title that I could give that would be accurate, because I'm just meandering in my head. I don't even know where I started. Did I start talking about migration? Was that it? Oh, but anyway, one last thing on this. So I thought when RFK was making essentially the MAGA pivot, and he started talking a lot like Trump, I thought, wow, this is dumb, because you're not going to win away any Trump voters. People who like Trump are going to vote for Trump. So talking like you're Trump and trying to woo away some of his voters, even at the expense of losing the more further left voters who are really concerned, let's say, who are really anti-Israel. This is going to end badly for you. You're going to get like 1-2% because you're appealing to nobody at that point. But I think I might have been wrong, because there are a lot of people who think like that, who share those ideas, who are Democrat voters. They're not active members of the Democrat Party. They're not elected officials in the Democrat Party. They're not in the party bureaucracy, but they vote Democrat. And they do agree with these things. And they absolutely would never vote for Trump. So you take the Trump platform and you slap the Kennedy brand on it, you got something there. And I think ultimately that could be what dooms Biden and the Democratic machine. Because Kennedy can compete in places where Donald Trump never would. And while he's not going to win Donald Trump any more votes, he's going to win he's going to take away a lot of votes from Biden. So much so that perhaps they won't be able to, let's say, harvest enough ballots to account for all that. I think that RFK will actually be able to make inroads into the most fertile ballot harvesting grounds. And if nothing else, it's going to complicate the logistics of the Democratic Party's operations. It's not going to do anything to complicate the RNC's operations if they're able to develop any kind of substantial machine by November. Because Kennedy is going to be in Republican areas where they're going to want to harvest large amounts of ballots. Kennedy is going to be a non-entity, I think. I mean, sure, you could have some red areas where Kennedy is beating Biden, but that's just because there's so little support for Biden to begin with. In fact, a sleeper that I haven't heard mentioned too much that would actually be a really smart pick for Kennedy as a running mate, I think would be Ice Cube, who Well, then again, he's doing the announcement in Oakland, and I don't think that Ice Cube has any connections to Oakland, does he? Because I pictured just now Ice Cube in my head wearing a Raiders jersey and thinking, oh yeah, he must be from Oakland. It's like, oh no, he's an L.A. Raiders fan. Um, and so if it were him, they probably wouldn't be doing this event in Oakland now, would they? But if it is some kind of more populist black pop culture figure, I think that would be borderline. Well, I don't know if I would say brilliant, because how hard is it to think of that? It's probably not. I just thought of it up on the spot, so it wouldn't be fair to call it brilliant. But it would be potentially the most efficient move. Because ideologically, the black community is the weakest link in the Democratic coalition. Because their interests, as far as their opinions issue by issue go, they're the least in line with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. But obviously, that is, as I've said time and time again, it's a waste of time for Republicans to try and appeal to them. The black community is not going to shift to voting for Republican. It's just there's too many cultural differences. There are too many differences that matter more than rational policy positions. But for someone like an RFK Jr., he doesn't have those issues. After all, his father, RFK Sr., in the Democratic Party, did exceedingly well in black neighborhoods. And granted, that was, 60 years ago. And so perhaps even that same style is not going to resonate as well. I think he has a much better chance at peeling away those folks than Trump does. And Biden is not really doing anything to keep them. Especially now that immigration is such a hot topic. Mass migration is not something that, to my knowledge, has ever been popular in the black community, even though over the past 20 years or so, white Democrats have become increasingly in favor of mass migration. That has never happened in the black community, and there's a lot of upheaval right now in these poor neighborhoods in the inner cities that are receiving busloads of migrants that are finally being shipped up by red states. They're starting to feel the effects of the leadership of people like Joe Biden. And I think they are ripe for hearing a new message, not from Donald Trump, but perhaps from someone else, especially if that new voice, RFK Jr., comes with the stamp of approval and in a partnership with someone who is already well respected and well known throughout most black communities in America. The poor ones, at least. The ones who are dealing directly with illegal immigration, trying to compete with them in the labor market, and also gang issues, the drug trade, generalized violence and crime. And if you erode that black democratic monolith only a bit, it quickly becomes impossible for Joe Biden to win in many states. In fact, I could see a scenario in which Joe Biden wins Arizona and Georgia and ends up losing Pennsylvania and Michigan, perhaps even Wisconsin. And I'll give you a hint. It wouldn't happen because Donald Trump won over 50% of the vote. Trump, I don't think, can win an outright majority in any of these states. And after all, even in 2016, when Trump did win all three of these states, many whiny Democrats blamed that on Jill Stein and said, well, if you take the total number of minute ballots that were won by Jill Stein and you added them to Hillary Clinton's total, well, that was more than Trump, and so Hillary should have won. Now, truth be told, the people who were voting for Jill Stein she was such a niche candidate. If you went out of your way to cast a ballot for Jill Stein, you had no interest in voting for Hillary Clinton. People weren't voting for Jill Stein because they thought she could win. People were voting for Jill Stein as a protest vote because they held nothing but contempt for Hillary Clinton. But in RFK's case, I think that people who could actually be swayed away, who were otherwise going to show up and vote for Biden because of souls to the polls, perhaps, or other get out the vote efforts or ballot harvesting measures implemented in these urban areas by the Democratic Party. These people might say, you know what, I am going to go vote when the Democratic organizer comes around to collect their ballot or to get them on a bus to bus them to the polling places. But when they actually get in the booth, they might end up voting for someone else other than Joe Biden. It's not like the old days where you could show a copy of your ballot to the local Democratic organizer and they'd give you a free bottle of whiskey. We have a secret ballot now, and so just because you're getting out the vote in these areas that ordinarily vote upwards of 95% Democrat, and to where you would think automatically by increasing the voter turnout, we're helping Joe Biden. If RFK is able to make inroads in these areas, the Democratic get out the vote effort will be much less effective. Yes, on net, these areas will still support Joe Biden, but if it's not by the margins that the Democratic Party is counting on, they will not be able to overcome Trump's lead in the other areas of these various states. So with all that said, I have been going on for far too long about far too many different things. There was no narrative structure. There was absolutely no notes or planning. What I have said for more than 30 minutes now has probably come across as a garbled mess. But if any of you actually sat through that, I appreciate that. I hope I was able to offer some level of insight or something that engaged you on an intellectual level. And so with that said, I will see you back here in the next one.